It was an unusually warm evening in late September when I first received the unexpected request from my 60-year-old neighbor, Mrs. Evelyn Harper. She was a widow, having lived alone in the small house next door ever since her husband passed away 3 years ago. I had always admired her strength, the way she maintained her independence despite the loneliness that must have weighed on her shoulders. I never imagined that she would ask me for something that would change everything between us. Evelyn had always been kind to me since I moved into the neighborhood a year ago. We shared polite conversations over the fence, exchanged a few friendly smiles, and even helped each other with small things around the house. But that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, she knocked on my door. "Jacob, do you have a moment?" she asked, her voice as calm and collected as ever, though there was something in her eyes that made me hesitate. A sort of vulnerability I hadn't seen before. "Of course, Mrs. Harper," I replied, opening the door wider. "Is everything okay?" She smiled softly, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Please call me Evelyn. And yes, everything is fine. I just need a little help in the backyard. Would you mind?" I nodded, unsure of what to expect, but curious nonetheless. I grabbed my keys and followed her across the small patch of grass that separated our houses. As we walked, a cool breeze rustled through the leaves of the large oak tree in her yard, and I felt a sense of unease settle over me, though I couldn't quite place why. When we reached her backyard, I noticed something I hadn't before. Underneath the carefully maintained garden beds and the neatly trimmed hedges, there was a certain level of disarray. Small items were scattered about: tools, an old chair, and a few potted plants that had been overturned. It wasn't like Evelyn to leave things in such disrepair. "I've been meaning to clean this up for a while," she said softly, her gaze sweeping over the mess. "But it's just too much for me. Would you mind helping me move a few things?" "Of course," I said, stepping forward, eager to help. "I'll start with the heavier stuff." As I began picking up the scattered tools, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to this than just a messy backyard. Evelyn stood close by, her eyes following my every move. There was a quiet intensity in the air, a tension I hadn't expected. I tried to focus on the task at hand, but my mind kept drifting back to the way she had looked at me when she first knocked on my door, like she needed something more than just help with her yard. "Jacob," she said suddenly, her voice low. I turned to find her standing just a few feet away, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "I need to tell you something." I stopped what I was doing and faced her, waiting for her to continue. She hesitated, her gaze flickering to the ground before meeting mine again. There was something in her expression, an emotion that I couldn't quite name. I've been feeling very lonely lately," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "And I've realized that I don't have anyone to talk to, not in the way I need. It's been hard, losing my husband and, well, I don't know how to say this, but I've come to rely on you, Jacob. More than I should." Her words hung in the air between us, heavy and laden with meaning. I wasn't sure what to say. I had always thought of Evelyn as my neighbor, someone I respected and admired, but I had never considered that she might feel anything more than that. And yet, as she stood there, looking at me with those piercing eyes, I realized that I had noticed her more than I cared to admit. The way she moved with grace and confidence, the way her laughter lingered in the air long after it had faded. "Evelyn," I began, unsure of where to go from there. But she took a step closer, cutting off whatever words I might have said. "I don't expect anything from you, Jacob," she said quickly, her voice trembling slightly. "But I needed you to know how I feel. I don't want to keep it inside anymore. I don't want to be alone anymore." Her vulnerability took me by surprise. This was a woman who had always seemed so composed, so in control of her life. And now, she was standing before me, bearing her heart in a way that felt both intimate and terrifying. Without thinking, I reached out and gently took her hand. The contact was electric, sending a shockwave through my body that left me breathless. Her fingers were soft, warm, and they trembled slightly as I held them. For a moment, neither of us spoke. We just stood there, the air thick with tension, the weight of her confession settling between us. "I don't want you to feel alone," I said softly, my thumb brushing over the back of her hand. "You're not alone, Evelyn." She looked up at me then, her eyes filled with a mixture of hope and fear. There was something unspoken between us, something that had been building quietly over the past year, though neither of us had dared to acknowledge it. And in that moment, standing there in the fading light of her backyard, with the soft breeze carrying the scent of jasmine, everything changed. "Thank you, Jacob," she whispered, her voice breaking slightly. "Thank you for being here." I stepped closer, unable to stop myself. There was something magnetic about her presence, something that drew me in, even as every rational part of my mind screamed that this was a line we shouldn't cross. But when she lifted her gaze to mine, her eyes filled with such raw emotion, I knew there was no going back. "Maybe we could sit for a while," she said softly, gesturing to the small bench beneath the oak tree. "Just talk, if you don't mind." I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest as we made our way to the bench. We sat in silence for a few moments, the weight of the unspoken hanging between us. I could feel the warmth of her body next to mine, the subtle brush of her arm against my side, and it was all I could do to keep my thoughts from spiraling out of control. But then she turned to me, her eyes soft and filled with something I couldn't quite place. "Do you ever feel like life just passes you by, Jacob? Like you're watching it happen, but you're not really living it?" Her words struck a chord deep within me. I had felt that way more times than I cared to admit. It was as if she had reached into the very core of my being and pulled out the one thing I had been too afraid to acknowledge. "Yes," I said quietly, my voice barely audible. "I feel that way all the time." She smiled sadly, her hand reaching out to rest gently on my knee. The touch was innocent enough, but it sent a jolt of electricity through me that left me breathless. "Maybe we don't have to feel that way anymore," she whispered, her voice soft and full of longing. I looked at her, my heart racing, and in that moment, I knew there was no turning back. The connection between us was undeniable, and it was pulling me toward her with a force I couldn't resist. Slowly, I leaned in, my hand trembling as I reached up to cup her cheek. She didn't pull away. Instead, she closed her eyes, leaning into my touch with a soft sigh that sent shivers down my spine. And then, before I could second-guess myself, I closed the distance between us, pressing my lips to hers in a soft, tentative kiss. It was gentle at first, a whisper of a touch, but as her hand slid up to the back of my neck, pulling me closer, the kiss deepened. The kiss deepened slowly, like a wave rising steadily from the ocean's depths, gaining strength with every passing second. My hand, still resting on her cheek, slid down to her shoulder, feeling the warmth of her skin through the thin fabric of her sweater. Evelyn responded in kind, her fingers threading through my hair, drawing me even closer, as though we were two magnets pulled together by some unseen force. The world around us seemed to disappear, leaving only the two of us in that moment, suspended in time. For a brief moment, I pulled back, my breath shaky as I looked into her eyes. Her cheeks were flushed, her lips slightly parted, and in her gaze, I saw the same mix of desire and uncertainty that swirled inside me. "Evelyn, My voice trailed off as I struggled to find the words. What could I say? There was no easy way to explain what was happening between us, no way to rationalize the emotions that had suddenly surfaced. But she silenced me with a gentle touch to my lips, her eyes soft but full of intensity. "We don't have to say anything, Jacob. Not right now." I nodded, feeling a lump in my throat. The truth was, I didn't know how to explain what I was feeling. All I knew was that I didn't want this moment to end, no matter how complicated it might be. I could feel the weight of the forbidden hanging over us, but in that instant, it didn't seem to matter. All that mattered was the way she looked at me, the way her touch made me feel more alive than I had in years. Without another word, I kissed her again, this time more confidently, my hand sliding down to her waist, pulling her closer. Her body pressed against mine, and I could feel her heart racing in sync with my own. There was something intoxicating about the way she responded to me, the way her hands clung to my shoulders as though she was afraid to let go. As the kiss deepened, I could feel the heat between us growing, an undeniable pull that neither of us could ignore. My hand moved to her back, tracing slow, deliberate circles along her spine, feeling the way her body trembled beneath my touch. Evelyn let out a soft gasp, her breath warm against my lips, and I could feel the tension between us building to a crescendo. "Jacob," she whispered, her voice barely audible as she pulled back slightly, her forehead resting against mine. This feels so right, but it's also so wrong. What are we doing?" I closed my eyes, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't have an answer for her, at least not one that made sense. All I knew was that I couldn't stop, not now. There was something undeniable between us, something that had been building for months, even if neither of us had been willing to admit it. Now, it was out in the open, and there was no turning back. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice thick with emotion. "But I don't want to stop." Evelyn's eyes searched mine, her expression a mixture of desire and doubt. For a long moment, we just looked at each other, the weight of our actions pressing down on us. But then, with a soft sigh, she leaned in and kissed me again, her lips soft and warm against mine. "I don't want to stop either," she whispered between kisses, her hands sliding down my arms, her touch sending shivers through me. We sat there on the bench for what felt like hours, kissing softly, our bodies pressed together, the world outside fading away. I could feel the warmth of her skin through her clothes, the gentle rise and fall of her chest as she breathed against me, and it was all I could do to keep my emotions in check. At some point, we pulled apart, breathless and flushed, our hands still entwined. Evelyn leaned her head against my shoulder, her body nestled against mine, and for the first time in a long while, I felt at peace. "I've been so lonely, Jacob," she admitted softly, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't realize how much until now. I wrapped my arm around her, holding her close as I rested my chin on the top of her head. "I've been lonely too," I confessed, my voice thick with emotion. "I didn't know how much I needed this, needed you." She looked up at me then, her eyes filled with a sadness that broke my heart. "This can't be right, can it?" she asked softly, her voice trembling. "I'm so much older than you. What will people say? What will you think when this moment is over?" I swallowed hard, the weight of her words settling over me like a heavy fog. I knew she was right. What we were doing was unconventional, and there would be consequences. But at that moment, all I could think about was the connection we shared, the way she made me feel, the way we seemed to understand each other in a way no one else did. "I don't care about any of that," I said quietly, my fingers gently brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "All I care about is how I feel when I'm with you. And right now, this feels right." Evelyn smiled softly, though her eyes were still clouded with doubt. "I don't want to hurt you, Jacob," she whispered. "I don't want to complicate your life." "You're not complicating anything," I assured her, my hand cupping her cheek. "You're making it better." For a moment, we sat in silence, the weight of our unspoken thoughts hanging between us. I could feel the tension still simmering beneath the surface, a tension that neither of us seemed quite ready to address. But then Evelyn shifted in my arms, her gaze locked on mine, and I knew that whatever happened next, there was no going back. "Come inside," she whispered, her voice soft but full of intent. "Please, Jacob." I nodded, my heart racing as she stood up and took my hand, leading me toward her house. My mind was spinning, a whirlwind of emotions and thoughts that I couldn't quite grasp, but all of it faded as we stepped through the door and into the dimly lit living room. The house was quiet, the only sound the soft ticking of the clock on the wall. Evelyn turned to face me, her hand still in mine, and I could see the uncertainty flickering in her eyes. But there was something else too, a quiet resolve, a decision that had been made, even if she wasn't sure of it yet. Slowly, she reached up and cupped my face in her hands, her fingers warm against my skin. "I need this, Jacob," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I need you." Her words sent a jolt of electricity through me, and before I could think, before I could stop myself, I kissed her again, my hands sliding to her waist as I pulled her closer. The kiss was more urgent this time, filled with a need that neither of us could deny. Evelyn responded in kind, her arms wrapping around my neck as she pressed against me, her body soft and warm. We stumbled toward the couch, our hands exploring, our kisses deepening with every passing second. I could feel the heat between us growing, the tension that had been building for so long finally reaching its breaking point. Evelyn pulled back slightly, her breath ragged as she looked at me, her eyes filled with a mixture of desire and fear. "Are you sure?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest. "I've never been more sure." With that simple affirmation, everything between us shifted, like a dam finally breaking after being held back for so long. Evelyn's eyes softened, and without another word, she kissed me again, her lips hungry and searching. My hands found the small of her back, pulling her closer as we sank onto the couch together, the heat between us undeniable. The feeling of her body pressed against mine sent a thrill through me, one that left me breathless and wanting more. Our movements were slow at first, tentative, as if we were both afraid of what this meant, of the line we were about to cross. But the hesitation didn't last long. As the kiss deepened, so did our need for each other, a need that had been building quietly for months, unspoken but ever-present. It was as if every touch, every kiss, was an answer to the questions we hadn't dared ask, and the intensity of it all left me dizzy. Evelyn's hand slid under my shirt, her touch warm and deliberate as her fingers traced the muscles of my back. I gasped against her lips, the sensation sending a shiver down my spine. She pulled back for a moment, her eyes searching mine as if looking for reassurance. I gave it to her with a slow, lingering kiss, my hands cupping her face as I whisper her name against her lips. She smiled, her breath shaky as she leaned into me, her forehead resting against mine. "I never thought I'd feel this way again," she admitted, her voice so soft it was almost a whisper. "I never thought. I didn't think this was possible." I brushed a strand of hair behind her ear, my thumb tracing the line of her jaw. "Neither did I said, my voice thick with emotion. "But here we are." Her hands trembled slightly as they moved down my arms, and I could see the internal conflict playing out in her eyes. This was something neither of us had anticipated, and yet, we had both been heading toward it for so long. "I want this, Jacob," she said softly, her gaze locking with mine. "But I'm afraid of what this will mean for both of us." I could feel the weight of her words pressing down on me, but at that moment, I knew there was no going back. "I'm afraid too," I confessed, my hand sliding to the back of her neck, pulling her closer. "But I can't walk away from this, from you." Her eyes glistened with unshed tears, and she leaned in, kissing me gently, her lips soft and tender. "Then let's not walk away," she whispered. "Let's see where this takes us." We moved slowly, deliberately, savoring every touch, every kiss, as if time had slowed down just for us. Her hand slipped beneath my shirt, and I helped her lift it over my head, tossing it to the side without a second thought. Her fingers explored the contours of my chest, her touch sending sparks of electricity through me with every pass. I let out a soft sigh, my head tilting back as I surrendered to the sensation of her hands on my skin. Evelyn pressed her lips to my neck, her breath warm against my skin, and I could feel her trembling slightly, though whether from nerves or desire, I couldn't be sure. I wrapped my arms around her, pulling her closer as her kisses grew more urgent, more demanding. We lost ourselves in each other, the world outside forgotten, as we explored the boundaries of this new, fragile connection. My hands moved to the hem of her sweater, hesitating for just a moment before gently lifting it over her head. She didn't stop me. Instead, she met my gaze with a mixture of vulnerability and desire that left me breathless. "I've never done anything like this before," she confessed quietly, her fingers brushing against my cheek. "Not like this." I leaned in, kissing her softly, my hands resting on her waist. "Neither have I admitted. But we'll figure it out together." She smiled, her eyes filled with warmth as she leaned into me once more. Our lips met in a slow, sensual kiss, one that sent a rush of heat through my entire body. I could feel the tension between us building again, an invisible thread pulling us closer, tighter, until it felt like we might burst from the intensity of it. Evelyn's hands roamed over my chest, her touch deliberate and slow, as if she was memorizing every inch of my skin. I responded in kind, my fingers tracing the curve of her spine, drawing a soft gasp from her lips as I pulled her closer. There was a sweetness to the way we touched each other, a tenderness that belied the passion simmering beneath the surface. It wasn't long before we found ourselves tangled together on the couch, our bodies pressed close, the heat between us undeniable. The soft glow of the lamp bathed us in a warm light, casting shadows across the room, and for a moment, it felt as though we were the only two people in the world. Nothing else mattered, not the doubts, not the fears, not the consequences that would surely follow. All that mattered was the way she made me feel, the way our connection seemed to transcend everything else. I kissed her again, slow and deep, my hands sliding up her back, savoring the way her body responded to my touch. Her breath hitched as my fingers traced the length of her spine, and I could feel her shiver beneath me. She pulled back slightly, her eyes meeting mine with a look of raw vulnerability. "I've wanted this for so long," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "But I never thought it would actually happen." "Neither did I admitted, my thumb brushing her cheek. "But I'm glad it did." We stayed like that for a long moment, our foreheads pressed together, our breaths mingling as we held each other close. There was a tenderness to the way she looked at me, a softness in her gaze that made my heart ache with a mixture of longing and uncertainty. "Are you sure about this?" she asked softly, her fingers brushing against my lips. "Are you sure this is what you want?" I nodded, my heart racing in my chest. "I've never been more sure of anything." She smiled then, a small, fragile smile that spoke of hope and fear in equal measure. "Then let's not waste any more time." We moved together, slow and deliberate, savoring every touch, every kiss, as though it might be our last. The tension that had been building between us for so long finally found its release, and it was both exhilarating and terrifying at the same time. I could feel the weight of her body against mine, the warmth of her skin beneath my fingertips, and it felt as though we had crossed a line that neither of us could return from. But in that moment, none of it mattered. All that mattered was the way she made me feel, the way we seemed to fit together in a way I had never expected. As we lay there afterward, tangled in each other's arms, the weight of what had just happened began to settle over us. I could feel her breath against my chest, slow and steady, and I wrapped my arms around her, holding her close as the reality of it all began to sink in. There were no words to describe what I was feeling. A mixture of contentment, fear, and uncertainty swirled inside me, but at the center of it all was a sense of peace, a feeling that somehow, this was where I was meant to be. Evelyn stirred slightly, her head resting on my chest as she looked up at me, with a soft smile. "Are you okay?" she asked quietly, her voice full of concern. I nodded, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I'm more than okay," I whispered, leaning down to kiss her gently on the forehead. She smiled again, though there was a flicker of doubt in her eyes. "This is going to change everything, isn't it?" "Yes," I admitted softly, my heart heavy with the truth of it. "But I think it's worth it." Evelyn nodded, her expression filled with a quiet acceptance, though the uncertainty in her eyes lingered. She shifted in my arms, resting her head back on my chest, and we both lay in silence, letting the weight of the night settle over us. I could feel her heartbeat against my skin, slow and steady, a rhythm that seemed to mirror the slow turn of my thoughts. We had crossed a line, one we could never uncross. And yet, lying there with her in the quiet intimacy of her living room, I couldn't bring myself to feel any regret. There was something so deeply fulfilling about the connection we shared, something that went beyond the physical. It was as if we had both been waiting for this moment, even if we hadn't realized it until now. But I couldn't ignore the voice in the back of my mind, the one that whispered of the complications that would follow. This wasn't just a fleeting moment, something we could brush aside in the light of day. This was real, and it was going to change everything. After a long while, Evelyn stirred again, her hand resting lightly on my chest as she looked up at me, her eyes searching mine. "What now?" she asked softly, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't have an answer for her. The future felt uncertain, the path ahead filled with unknowns. But I knew one thing for sure. I didn't want to lose what we had found. "We take it one day at a time," I said quietly, my fingers tracing the curve of her arm. "We figure it out together." She smiled softly, though the doubt still flickered in her gaze. "Jacob, you're young. You have your whole life ahead of you. I don't want to hold you back from that." I shook my head, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "You're not holding me back," I said firmly. "I choose this, Evelyn. I choose you." Her eyes glistened with unshed tears, and she leaned in, pressing a soft kiss to my lips. "I don't deserve you," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "But I'm so glad you're here." I kissed her back, my heart aching with the intensity of the moment. "We'll figure it out," I repeated, though I wasn't sure if I was trying to convince her or myself. "Whatever happens, we'll figure it out." We stayed like that for a long time, holding each other in the quiet of her home, letting the world outside fade away. There were so many questions left unanswered, so many uncertainties about what the future would hold. But for now, all that mattered was the way she felt in my arms, the warmth of her body against mine, the soft rhythm of her breath. Eventually, the weight of the night caught up with us, and we drifted off to sleep, wrapped in each other's warmth. The quiet hum of the clock on the wall was the only sound in the room, a gentle reminder that time was still moving forward, even if we wished it would stand still for just a little longer. When I woke up the next morning, the early light filtering through the curtains, I found Evelyn still nestled against me, her head resting on my chest. Her face was peaceful, her expression soft in sleep, and for a moment, I allowed myself to simply watch her, to take in the quiet beauty of the moment. It felt fragile, like something that could slip away if I wasn't careful. As I lay there, I couldn't help but wonder what the day would bring, what we would say to each other when the reality of what we had done set in. Would she regret it? Would I? But then she stirred, her eyes fluttering open as she looked up at me with a sleepy smile. "Good morning," she whispered, her voice soft and full of affection. "Good morning," I replied, my hand gently brushing her hair back. "How do you feel?" She sighed, resting her chin on my chest as she looked at me thoughtfully. "I feel strange," she admitted. "Happy but scared at the same time. This is so much more than I ever expected." I nodded, understanding all too well. "I feel the same." We lay there for a while longer, the silence between us comfortable but charged with unspoken thoughts. There was so much to say, so much to figure out, but neither of us seemed ready to face it just yet. Eventually, Evelyn sat up, pulling the blanket around her shoulders as she looked down at me with a sad smile. "I don't know what's going to happen, Jacob. I don't know if we can make this work, if the world will ever understand." I sat up beside her, taking her hand in mine. "Maybe the world doesn't have to understand," I said quietly. "Maybe it's enough that we understand." She looked at me, her eyes full of emotion, and for a moment, I thought she might cry. But instead, she smiled, a small, fragile smile that spoke of hope, even in the face of uncertainty. "I hope you're right," she whispered, leaning in to kiss me softly on the lips. For the rest of the morning, we moved around each other with a quiet intimacy, exchanging soft touches and lingering glances. There was an undeniable warmth between us, but beneath it all was the weight of the unknown, the unspoken fears about what lay ahead. We didn't talk about the future that day, didn't make any promises or plans. Instead, we simply existed in the moment, savoring the connection we had found, even if it was fleeting. And maybe that was enough. As the sun began to set once again, casting a golden glow over the backyard, Evelyn took my hand and led me outside, back to the bench where it had all begun. We sat together in silence, watching the sky change colors, our fingers intertwined, and for a brief moment, it felt like the world had paused just for us. "I don't know what's going to happen," she said quietly, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "But I'm glad we had this." I squeezed her hand, my heart heavy with the truth of her words. "Me too," I whispered. And as we sat there, the last rays of the sun disappearing behind the trees, I knew that whatever happened next, whether our story continued or ended here, this moment would stay with me forever. "Whatever comes," I said softly, "I'll never forget this." Evelyn looked at me then, her eyes filled with a mix of emotions, hope, fear, and something deeper, something that couldn't be put into words. "Neither will I," she whispered. And with that, we sat together in the fading light, holding on to the moment for as long as we could, knowing that it might be all we had.